Google fired an employee this week just to prove that it stands against discrimination that wasn't actually discrimination, all while on the brink of a new lawsuit and an investigation by the U.S. Department of Labor alleging that Google actively engages in discrimination. The two incidents aren't directly connected, but you have to admit the timing is genius. In case you somehow missed all of the fire and fury on social media, the gist of it goes like this. Google has engaged in some questionable practices in the noble pursuit of equality. A male employee questioned it in an internal memo, baffled its readers with scientific fact and the outlandish suggestion that people be treated as individuals rather than a group, and was promptly fired for being sexist. If you think that this sounds ridiculous, that's because it is. So here's the breakdown. Last week, an internal memo by now former Google employee James Damore went viral inside the company, somehow ended up printed in full by Gizmodo, and sent the internet into a rage, even though a good chunk of the people raging will admit to not actually reading the memo when you sit down and ask them. This was, of course, perpetuated by some very slanted and inflammatory media coverage. Here is just a small sampling.
Firing an employee behind a controversial anti-diversity manifesto.
Circulating a 3,300-word sexist memo.
A breathtakingly sexist memo.
Where he's essentially saying, well, I don't really like women anywhere near a computer. And it should.
Google employees saying that women are inferior, and that's why there are not as many women software engineers.
A Google employee's anti-diversity screed
Rails against diversity and gender equality,
alleging that men are better at tech jobs than women.
Slamming his female co-workers in the process.
Paraphrasing, this is a guy who's basically saying, I don't like women around computers. They can't handle high-stress work. Yes, he did say that.
I don't know what memo they read, but the one I'm looking at is called Google's Ideological Echo Chamber and starts with the sentence, I value diversity and inclusions, am not denying that sexism exists, and don't endorse using stereotypes. He also argues that Google is undoubtedly biased to the left, like the way left, and either shames people who disagree or fires them. Which they did. Some people may ask, why did this guy go and circulate his opinions knowing he would get penalized or even fired for it? Well, in an interview with the University of Toronto professor Jordan Peterson, it's because he attended a secretive Google meeting in which the company talked about potentially illegal practices they have been doing in the name of diversity. He also says that most meetings at Google are recorded, but this one wasn't, presumably so there'd be no paper trail. 3 years ago, Google made it their mission to have a 50-50 split for male and female employees to better represent the panoply of people it serves. No surprise, 7 out of 10 Google employees are still men. And why is that? Well, for starters, the 7 in 10 ratio is on par with about how many women versus men pursue tech and STEM degrees. This so-called anti-diversity manifesto has some ideas as to why that is and how dare they bring science into it. The 8-page document points out Google's and many other social justice warriors' belief that all disparities in representation are due to oppression and, therefore, the way to correct for this oppression is through discrimination. They may not say it that way in their heads, but that's pretty much what they're doing. And diversity chief after diversity chief keep getting hired and then fired at all these big STEM companies because no one has bothered to sit down and read any of the countless psychological and neurological studies that point out the differences between male and female brains. Now, I'm not the neurological and evolutionary expert that many Twitter commentators claim to be, but I do have 3 separate degrees in psychology, and the points that Damore made are consistent with the research in the field. Sorry. Rong Su, James Rounds, and Patrick Ian Armstrong, for example, found substantial sex differences in vocational interests when using Holland's vocational choice categories. Joe Ida Hansen et al. Had similar results. Richard A. Lippa found gender differences in the very traits mentioned in the memo in 53 nations. Paul T. Costa Jr., Antonio Teresiano, and Robert R. McCrae found those same differences across the 26 cultures that they they studied. So did Alan Feingold, Smith et al., and Chapman et al., whose study is also featured on the National Institute of Health website. And that's just on the first page of a Google Scholar search. James Damore apparently has read some of these studies and commented on them in his memo. He wrote, "Differences in distributions of traits between men and women may, in part, explain why we don't have 50% representation of women in tech and leadership." He went on to talk about biological differences between men and women that are universal, meaning they are found across most, if not all, human cultures. These differences make sense from an evolutionary psychology perspective and are, surprise, linked to prenatal hormone exposure. In the section of the memo about biological differences, Damore made sure to note that not all men and women follow this strict paradigm, that there is actually a lot of overlap between the sexes, and that reducing someone to their group identity ignores that overlap and all the wonderful qualities that makes them an individual. And yet, according to Damore, Google's reason for firing him was, quote, perpetuating gender stereotypes.
You're fired.
So what exactly are these stereotypes? They include, but are not limited to, that on average, men and women have different interests, especially when it comes to careers, a point that I've spoken on before in my gender gap video, a point that, again, is backed up by countless studies, including work done over at Harvard. He also points out that women prefer working with people rather than things, often have higher emotional intelligence, have a more difficult time being assertive, are more agreeable, and have a higher tendency towards anxiety. All things that I learned in my gender studies and women's psychology courses in college. Now, Damore isn't saying that women are intellectually inferior. He's saying, hey, maybe this is part of the reason why the diversity initiative is failing. He's not saying that oppression doesn't exist. He's saying that lack of diversity in the workforce isn't necessarily because every CEO or executive or hiring manager is a sexist asshole.
What?
But the memo doesn't stop there. Damore then had the audacity to suggest ways in which Google could actually use those exact gender differences to help women thrive in the workforce. But here's the real kicker. One of his suggestions is to allow men to be more feminine. And in the same sentence, he praised feminism because he is so totally sexist. And as the cherry on the cake, he then went into a discussion of how Google's biases may be harming its employees and the work environment unintentionally. He doesn't even blame Google for its own behavior or biases. The memo suggestions section begins with the statement, I hope it's clear that I'm not saying that diversity is bad, that Google or society is 100% fair, that we shouldn't try to correct for existing biases, or that minorities have the same experience of those in the majority. My larger point is that we have an intolerance for ideas and evidence that don't fit a certain ideology. I'm also not saying that we should restrict people to certain gender roles. I'm advocating for quite the opposite. Treat people as individuals, not as just another member of their group. This somehow translates to women shouldn't be allowed near computers.
Yes, he did say that.
Some Google employees have complained that more people than they would like agree with the memo, but claim that those people are only men. That being said, an anonymous corporate survey found that more than half of all Google employees thought that Damore shouldn't have been fired. In fact, Uber, Airbnb, Yahoo, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and LinkedIn employees also weighed in with similar results. The memo's critics would have you believe that every last one of those people were male, but I find that hard to believe. Meanwhile, the Department of Labor says that Google systematically underpays women and thus has what they call a very significant discrimination problem. According to Glassdoor, though, this is again not because women aren't paid the same as men for the same work, but because women take up fewer of the higher paying and more technical jobs. So what it comes down to is that either Google does discriminate against women or that there are, in fact, biological differences between the sexes. Companies like Glassdoor call this an unexplainable phenomenon, saying women just tend to get sorted into these different types of jobs as if they don't have any agency in what jobs they apply to or find interesting. Kind of like the way that men just happen to get sorted into difficult jobs that have high rates of work-related fatalities. In the end, wanting to achieve X but being critical of the means used to achieve X does not make someone anti-X. Pointing out scientifically proven gender differences and the ways in which those differences can be used to help every individual thrive is not perpetuating gender stereotypes. It's science. Gender and individual differences aren't a bad thing. They're actually what makes the world work. The individual is the smallest minority, and individual differences are diversity. Diversity in sex, race, religion, orientation, thought, values, experiences, skills, everything. That concludes your Liberty-related news for the week. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. You can also find me over on Facebook, VidMe, and Twitter at The Liberty Doll. And if you really like my videos and want to help support my channel, you can support me over on Patreon or a one-time donation over at PayPal. So until next week, thanks for watching and helping me to spread the message of liberty.